Hello all, this is the part 4 of high yield topics in BCBR course. The reason why I make this video is many students given the feedback that there are few topics which has been missed, and also the recent additions into the course module has been missed in the 3 parts. So I tried compiling all those missed out parts, and also I tried to make a revision of the first 3 parts in this video. We had this study design algorithms. In BCBR course, they have given these 2 algorithms, the classification broadly into descriptive and analytical, under which we have these subheadings. But I recommended in that video only to go with this flowchart. It is broadly classified into experimental and observational. Under experimental, we have RCT and non-randomized control trials. Under observational studies, if we have no comparison group, then that's a descriptive study. All your case series, case report, ecological studies comes under this study. And if we have a comparison group, then that is an analytical study, under which we have to ask about the direction of the exposure and outcome. If exposure and outcome are measured at the same time, that's a cross-sectional study, and exposure to outcome is cohort study. Outcome to exposure or case to the exposure is called as case control study. So where we start is the key here to name the study design, as these 2 algorithms focus on naming the correct study design. But in BCBR course, they have given few more classification of study designs. On your right hand side, we have this classification, which is very simple. It can be classified into qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative will answer how or why. On the other hand, quantitative study answers how much. Then we have observational studies and experimental studies. Based on the interventions we are providing or not, we can classify into observational and experimental studies, and retrospective and prospective studies based on the direction of the study. If we have 2 contacts and we follow up the patient, that's called a prospective study. If we have 2 contacts, one right now, and we go back to the past, then that is called retrospective or backward looking studies. As I told earlier, the previous algorithms help us to name the study design correctly. That is, if we decide on the study design, to name it correctly, we use that algorithms. Now, this algorithm helps us to select the study design itself. Based on the nature of the objective, it is given. If our objective is to describe an acute problem, we will study the incidence. There, we will predominantly look at the cohort studies. If we are describing a chronic illness, then prevalence will be the parameter to study. For this, cross-sectional study will be the most apt study design. And when our objective is for comparing between 2 groups, then we have to ask whether we are going to study a common disease or a rare disease. If it is a rare disease, then better we go with case control study, and the parameter of our study will be odds ratio. If we are studying a common problem, then we can go with the cohort study or cross-sectional study. Their relative risk or odds ratio or prevalence ratio as the parameter of association. Based on the nature of the objective, if we are describing one group, we have to follow the algorithm here. If we are comparing 2 groups, then we have to follow the algorithm here. Then we have to ask the nature of the disease, if it is acute or chronic. As we all know, incidence is for acute diseases, prevalence is for chronic diseases. So the study designs are decided based on the objective, whether we are describing or comparing one group or 2 group, acute or chronic, common or rare disease. So like that, we decide on the study design. So this is the level of evidence. This is called as evidence pyramid. We have mentioned about this descriptive and analytical studies. For descriptive, we have to measure, and it is for generating hypothesis. To estimate will be the specific verb which we use in objective. And for analytical, compare will be in our objective. It is used to test the hypothesis. The verb which we use for objective will be to determine the factors associated, like that. So this is related to the study designs. We have seen about the synonyms of case control study and cohort study. With that, we have understood about the nature of the case control study and cohort study. So this is the cohort study. The soldiers with similar characteristics are called as cohorts. Classical cohort study in the history is Framingham study, where they had the history of exercise, alcohol, smoking, coffee intake and all, and they followed them up for the outcomes such as cardiovascular disease. Here it is the case control study. The classical example is the thalidomide tragedy, where few pregnant mothers consumed thalidomide as an antiemetic, and then the limb defects were common among the mothers who consumed thalidomide during their pregnancy. So these are the 2 classical examples. Then we have seen this direction of inquiry. For case control study, we start with cases and controls and we look for the exposure and non-exposure. For cohort study, we start with people without disease, that is exposed and non-exposed, and we look for the appearance of the disease or not. So that is the cohort study. So the starting point will be the case in case control study and exposed and unexposed in cohort study. Then we mentioned about the advantages and disadvantages of case control study, by which we understood the nature of case control study and cohort studies. And here is the disadvantages. Most of the times it will be a comparison between case control and cohort study. The advantages of cohort studies will be the disadvantages of case control study and vice versa. Now what we missed out in this case control study and cohort study comparison was the steps in the case control study and cohort study. The first and last step for both the case control study and cohort study will be the same. That is, for case control study, the selection of the cases and controls is the first step and the analysis will be the last step. Here also analysis will be the last step and the selection of the study subjects. Instead of cases and controls in case control study, we have selection of study subjects, exposed and non-exposed. So the exposed cohorts and non-exposed cohorts will be recruited into the study. So that is the first step in both the studies. Then the second step is the most important step in case control study, that is called as matching. And the third step will be the measurement of the exposure among the cases and controls. After matching, you get the controls, then you look for the exposure among the cases and controls, then you do your analysis. Here odds ratio will be the parameter and interpretation will be based on greater than 1, less than 1 and equal to 1, greater than 1 positive association, less than 1 negative association, equal to 1 no association. Same way here, after the selection of the study subjects, the exposed and non-exposed, then we measure the data on the exposure, then we select the comparison groups, then we need to follow up. As matching is the most critical and complicated step in case control study, same way cohort study, the most difficult step is the follow up. Then finally we land up in analysis. Here the parameter is the relative risk. The interpretation will be similar to your odds ratio. So the best measure of association here is relative risk, and for case control study it is odds ratio. So these are the steps involved in case control study and cohort study. Then we have seen about the construction of the 2x2 table. That is very important. Here I have mentioned about the 3 rules. That is, outcome should be on the top, exposure on the side, always positive first, negative next, positive first, negative next, then A, B, C, D. It is not A, B and C, D. It is A, B and C, D. With these 3 rules, we calculate the odds ratio by AD by BC and relative risk by incidence among exposed divided by incidence among unexposed. That is A by A plus C divided by B plus D. In this slide, we have discussed about validity. Validity is otherwise called as accuracy. There is a little confusion that they have used interchangeably validity, accuracy, precision and all. But validity is accuracy. The precision is otherwise called as reproducibility or repeatability or reliability. Valid means accurate, precise means repeatable. So this image is correct, but they have mentioned in a little confusing way. So remember this alone. Then we have the validity, that is internal validity and external validity. That is, truth within the study is called as internal validity and truth within the universe is called as external validity. And from the population, how we derive the study sample based on the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria parameters based on the geographical and temporal parameters. Then we discussed about the type of variables, where we had the mnemonic of NOIR, that is nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio. Again, nominal and ordinal can be broadly put up under categorical variable. Interval and ratio are discrete and continuous variable, can be put up under numerical variables. Then we discussed how we describe the data numerically, that is measures of central tendency, mean, median, mode, and measures of dispersion or variation, that is range, interquartile range, variance, standard deviation, coefficient of variation. All these questions are problem-based questions which they can ask in your BCBR exams. Then we discussed about the difference between the error and the bias. That is, error means simply error means it's a random error. Bias means it's a systematic error. The basic difference between random error and systematic error is that random error occurs by chance or it occurs randomly, whereas your bias occurs systematically. Random error occurs by chance and it occurs in all the directions, but systematic error or bias occurs in only one particular particular direction. Random error can be reduced by increasing the sample size, whereas your systematic error or the bias can be reduced only by improving the quality of the study. So that is the basic difference between error and bias. Selection bias, information bias, and confounding bias. Nowadays, there are more questions asked on bias. So I want to go little deep into the different types of bias. So first, I classify into three stages of bias. That is, one in the planning stage, next in the implementation stage, then third in the analysis and publication stage. So first in the planning stage, the most common bias they have mentioned is selection bias. It can be eliminated by a good eligibility criteria, that is by a good inclusion and exclusion criteria. You can reduce your selection bias. You can include all the incident cases into the study, then you can reduce this selection bias. Under selection bias, we have different types of selection bias, that is healthcare access bias, Neyman's bias, which is otherwise called as prevalence bias, survivor bias. Only people who are surviving out of the disease will come for the study. People who are died out of the disease will not come to participate in the study. And next is the Bergsonian bias, which is a bias which occurs due to the differential rate of admissions to the hospital. All the admitted patients will have a different type of characteristics. So only those people will get into our study. So that's called as Bergsonian bias. Then we have healthy worker effect, volunteer bias, exclusion bias, matching bias. All occurs within the selection bias. Then we have a misclassification bias. That is, most of the times we misclassify the population between diseased and non-diseased, exposed and non-exposed. So that can be reduced only with the good study protocol. So misclassification bias can be reduced with the good study protocol. And we have allocation bias. The difference between selection bias and allocation bias is, selection bias is the bias involved in people who are recruited into the study. Allocation bias is when we are allocating people for intervention, then we have a differential systematic error. We call it as allocation bias. That can be minimized by randomization. And we have ascertainment bias or measurement bias that can be reduced in the planning stage by having a good study tool. Next, we have biases in the implementation phase. The most important bias during the implementation phase is information bias, and that can be minimized by blinding. So when we blind between the study and the control groups, they are not aware of what they are receiving, whether they are receiving study intervention or the control intervention. That means placebo or standard treatment or the intervention of the study. If the patients, that is all their participants, both the study groups and control groups, are unaware of what they are receiving, it is called as blinding. So that will reduce the information bias in our study. And the interviewer bias, there may be interviewer bias, subject bias, recall bias, Hawthorne bias, attrition bias, all can occur during the implementation phase. This information bias is, as I mentioned, it's a bias with the differential information between study and the control group. Again, the interviewer bias, if the interviewer knows the study group and control group, there may be a systematic deviation of results. And we have subject bias. Apart from the information bias, subjects may respond differentially and produce systematic errors. Then we have recall bias or memory bias, which is due to the fact that the people who have suffered with the disease tend to remain the past events or think about the events which happened before. So they try to give more information compared to the non-deceased. So that happens with the recall bias. Then we have Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect is due to the fact that when the people are monitored or under surveillance, they behave in a different way, or most commonly in a better way. The results will be better when compared to the people who are not observed. So that is the Hawthorne effect. And we have attrition bias. Attrition bias is the bias due to the follow-up. When the last to follow is more in the study, there are many patients either not responding to the treatment or not alive after the intervention, may not represent in the study. So when this happens due to the loss of follow-up, this may induce the bias due to loss of follow-up, called as attrition bias. These are the bias which can happen at the implementation phase. And how to deal with this information bias? As I said, blinding is the best measure. They have mentioned in the presentation, we should have a precise operational definition of variables, detailed measurement protocols, repeated measurements on key variables, training and certification and recertification of people who are doing the data collection, data audits of interviewers of data centers, data cleaning, data analysis prior to publication. All can reduce the information bias. Now the bias during the last stage, that is the analysis and publication stage, we have publication bias. People try to publish studies when the study has produced interesting results or significant results, higher prevalence or lower prevalence than the normal, then they try to publish those studies. So this bias or the systematic deviation towards the interesting results is called as publication bias. And during the analysis, we have the most common bias, that is called as confounding, which can be reduced by matching or stratified analysis. Now, how to evaluate this association? When we find out a crude association, that may be due to chance. So for that only we look for the odds ratio, relative risks and all. Will tell these associations are not due to chance, that they are real. Then you need to put up that we are not facing any selection bias, we are not facing any information bias, we are not facing any confounding bias. Then you arrive at a causal association. We actually have a Bradford-Sills criteria for association and causation that has a different set of criteria, almost 10 criteria to judge an association as causation. Next, the most important topic or the recent addition is the qualitative research, which we have completely missed in the previous parts. So as I told earlier, quantitative answers how many, qualitative answers how and why. So when do we do this qualitative study? When we view a social phenomena holistically, when we need to explore the human behaviors, when we need to provide insight into the meaning of decision of people and actions, when we seek depth of understanding, when we ask why, how, and under what circumstances certain events occur, and when there is suitable vocabulary not available to communicate with the respondents, when there is a subject matter unfamiliar or insufficiently researched, we use this qualitative research methods. It is a study of human behavior or social phenomena to provide in-depth understanding of certain events or circumstances or decisions or actions. So in order to do that, we do this qualitative research. And here is a comparison between qualitative research and the quantitative research. Quantitative research, we deal with the numbers. The data in qualitative research will be text. That is, whatever the information they provide, that will be in text. The view of the world will be, we start from the objective, we try to make it as measurable. We design the study from the external world and we try to get the data from the individuals. In qualitative study, it is the understanding of the social reality and it is subjectively interpreted and experienced by the individuals will be studied. And here the logic of the inquiry is called as deductive, that is, we try to test a formal hypothesis. Here it is inductive, that is, we are open to all hypotheses. We try to understand the social process which is derived from the data. Here the formulation of hypothesis is not the main objective, but the understanding of the social processes is there. Then here the research design ensures repeatability, that is, if you go measure again and again, you will get some results. But here it is the interpretation of the results of the participants which we are inquiring. Same way here the validity, otherwise called as the accuracy of the data, will be from the objective. Here it is called as credibility instead of accuracy. And cross-cultural generations, applications of the same observation method to different cultures. Here in qualitative study, it requires conversation in abstract intercultural categories. So these are the basic difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Now we move on to the different methods of qualitative research, under which we have two common types, that is in-depth interview and focused group discussion. In-depth interview is between one-to-one individual. We involve all the stakeholders. Suppose, let's say, if you are studying HIV/AIDS, we include a sex worker, we include a ASHA worker who works in that area, we include some patients, we include some people who are having sex with the sex workers, that we call it as bridging population. So each one representative will come and provide us understanding about the phenomenon. And here the sample size is not defined at the beginning of the study. We will continue the sample size until we reach a data saturation, that is, we get same information again and again, that is, no new information will be present. So at that point of time we can stop the data collection. So that is for the qualitative research. Focus group discussion also we do, that is between 5 to 10 people with the same homogeneous population. We have a discussion about this topic when we try to get the information. And there are basic difference between this in-depth interviews or individual interviews and the focus group discussion that we see here. So this is the in-depth interview or individual interviews. Here we have open-ended interviews. We try to discover interviews' own framework of meanings. It obtains a rich contextualized in-depth information. It tries to avoid imposing the researcher structures and assumptions. The technique is we follow an interview guide. This is otherwise called as topic guide also. That is the set of questions, what and all we are going to ask. And also we have the prompts also will be present within the topic guide. That is otherwise called as probes. Then we should have a reflection on remarks made by the informant. We need to collect the respondent's perspective and words. And this we need to do by the complete audio recording. We need to transcribe it and we need to do the data analysis. And when to use this in-depth interview is when we are studying a complex subject matter and knowledgeable respondents, we use this in-depth interviews. This can be helpful when we are dealing with highly sensitive subject matter, geographically dispersed respondents. When there is a peer pressure, we have a social desirability as a threat. So people will not answer when we ask questions in a group, but only when we go for in-depth interview, they will open up these issues. When these parameters are involved, we have to use this in-depth interview. And we have this focused group discussion. This is open-ended group interviews that promote discussion between participants on special topics, usually 6 to 8 similar participants. I mentioned homogeneous participants, that is people with similar characteristics, that is similar age, gender, socioeconomic status, education can be included for a healthy discussion. They should have similar cognitive structures, similar perception of their social environment, similar normative beliefs, and there should be a moderator and note taker, and there should be a flexible interview guide. So we have a topic guide or the interview guide. We have a set of questions. We have a deviations here like that from the questions, and we get the answers, and we try to understand the phenomena or the event or the behavior of the individuals. So when to use this focus group discussion? When we feel the group interaction is important, when we have cost and timing issues, when we need to generate ideas for a problem identification and definition of goal, when we identify local group specific vocabulary and terminology, evaluating messages for an intervention, we will use this. Then what are all the advantages of in-depth interview and focus group discussion? Mostly in-depth interviews, we try to understand why behaviors are practiced, data on how people think and talk, conceptualizations of behavior, exact words and language people use among themselves can be studied based on a few people, usually not systematic sample, but purposeful or convenient sample only will be taken. It cannot be generalized as we are dealing with a single person. Interviews go for very long and that will provide lots of data. It is more time consuming to analyze. Researchers' opinions also will be included into the data. So those are the disadvantages of the in-depth interviews. Whereas in focus group discussion, the advantages are some people feel more comfortable and they talk more openly in group settings only. So for them, they will open in groups. It collects information on social norms, can provide lots of data in a less amount of time. And the disadvantages are difficult to access practice of very personal or sensitive behaviors in groups, not generalizable, subject to dominant personalities, sensitive to biased analysis, transcribing time consuming, often 30 to 40 pages each, difficult to identify speakers. Analytic challenge is present in focus group discussion. When we have the data, when we have multiple people talking, the information collected in the audio, when we are transcribing, it is difficult. Even though nowadays there are many softwares are present for transcribing and now the work is made easy, but for this qualitative analysis, the analysis is always a challenge. We have participation, observation, the other method of qualitative research. So the researcher becomes participant in the social event or the group under the study and records the observations. Here the advantages is the data is very deep and detailed, and the disadvantage is it is difficult to systematically collect, especially in middle of important moment, hard to take notes, so details may be forgotten. Analytic methods for observation notes not well described. We have two types of analysis, that is grounded theory and content analysis. Under grounded theory, we have these transcripts of interviews. Then we have potential analytical categories, divide the information into different analytical categories, that is called as themes. We develop from the transcripts of the interviews. Then we try to code the text into categories. Then we try to find relations among the categories. Then we try to build theoretical models, and we have exemplars. We always have quotes from the interviews, so we can quote the individuals exact words also. So that is the grounded theory. Under content analysis, we have theoretical framework. We have set of codes for variables in the theory, applying codes systematically to a set of text, unit of analysis by variable matrix from the texts and codes. The statistical analysis of the matrix will be done under content analysis, and there are softwares which does this analysis. And here we have an important concept called data triangulation. All your analysts or the theory, methods, and the data source all should provide the same sort of information. We have seen about the Boolean operators for the mesh terms, that is and, or, and not. Then we have seen this prevalence and incidence, that with the epidemiological tub, the tub inflow is called as incidence, and whatever contained in the tub is called as prevalence. Moved out is called as recovery and death. We discussed about prevalence, all cases, that is old and new cases. Incidence, so that N means new, so new cases divided by population at risk. The relationship between P and I is P is equal to I into D. P is equal to incident into mean duration of the disease. Incidence is used for the acute diseases, and prevalence is used for the chronic diseases. So that is what we have seen with the incidence and prevalence. We have also seen about when does this prevalence increases and decreases. And in the second part, we have seen this cumulative incidence density and period prevalence. We have mentioned about the sampling methods. So sampling is a process by which the study samples are selected from the study population. We broadly classified it into probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling is otherwise called as random sampling, which is again we have the four commonly used method, that is simple random, cluster, systematic, and stratified random sampling. Under non-probability sampling, we have convenience, judgmental or purposive, snowball sampling, quota sampling, and each of this sampling is described here. The advantages and disadvantages can be dealt in detail. Simple random sampling, as the name indicates, it's not simple. We need to have the entire line listing of the population, and using some random generated numbers from computers or lot basis or currency method, we need to select the study population randomly after having the entire list of population. So it is not simple as the name indicates, but it is called a simple random sampling. So the principle here is everybody gets equal chance for being a sampling unit. That is present for any probability sampling. All the participants, the study population will have equal chance to be a study participant in the study. The procedure, we need to number all the units, then randomly draw the units by random generated number. The advantages here, it is simple. If we know the number of units, the sampling error can be easily measured with this method. The disadvantage is we need to have the complete list of units. It does not always achieve the best representation. Then we move on to the systematic random sampling. We collect the sample systematically. If our calculated sample size is n, the total population is capital N. We call this as sampling interval, that is total population or the study population divided by sample size. So this K will be the sampling interval. Let's say the sampling interval is 5. So every fifth individual will be the participant in the study. Equal chance is given for every participant to participate. K is equal to capital N divided by small n. Then we need to draw a random number for the starting. That is for the first sample, we get a random number. Then after that, every K units has to be added. Then that person will be included as a sample. The advantages with this systematic sampling is it ensures representatively across the list, easy to implement. We need not have the numbering of all the units. We have the disadvantages, dangerous if list has cycles. Then we have stratified sampling. As the name indicates, we divided it into different stratas. Under the stratas, we select a particular number of people. The principle is classify population into homogeneous subgroups called as strata based on age, gender, or other socioeconomic status. We divide it into strata or groups and draw sample from each strata so that the representativeness will be ensured. Then combine results of all strata. So advantage is more precise if the variable associated with the strata, then all the subgroups represented, allowing separate conclusions about each of them. Suppose let's say if there is a confounding variable, you can put that confounding variable into a strata also. That will eliminate the confounding bias. Disadvantages is sampling error is difficult to measure. Loss of precision if small numbers are sampled in individual strata. Then we move on to the cluster sampling. Here the principle is random sample of groups, that is a cluster of units will be selected. The advantage will be simple, no line listing is required. There is a less travel, resources are limited. But the disadvantage is it is imprecise if we are measuring the clusters. The homogeneous groups will be recruited for the study. So large study design effect will be present. The sampling error is difficult to measure. Then we have the last multi-stage sampling, that is we combine these samplings together. So the principle here is several chained samples will be present, several statistical units will be present. Advantages will be no complete listing of population required, most feasible approach for large population. Disadvantages will be several sampling lists will be present. Sampling error is difficult to measure. If you want more detail about sampling methods, I have a separate video on that. You can see that it will be really helpful for you. Then we have discussed about the types of errors under this table, our study result and null hypothesis. When we have the four scenarios, these two are right decisions and these two are errors, we remembered by the mnemonic ART, that is alpha error is rejecting null hypothesis when it is actually true. Reverse of it is a beta error is accepting null hypothesis when it is actually false. And the probability of committing this alpha error or the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true is called as p-value, and the inverse of this beta, that is 1 minus beta, is called as the power of the study. Then we have seen about the sample size calculation basics. So the steps here, we need to identify the major study variables. We need to get a similar study based on the good review of literature. Then we need to understand the parameter, whether we are dealing with the mean or a proportion. Then we need to apply on the sample size formula. We have online calculators, apps, softwares and all. But for exam purpose, we need to remember the sample size calculations for single groups and double groups, mean and proportion. So we need to adjust for population size, estimated design effect and response rate. So these are the steps in sample size calculation. This is about the Z values corresponding to the different levels of type 1 error and type 2 error. The most commonly used 0.05. For that, Z alpha value will be 1.96. We need to remember this value because we put this in sample size calculation. And for Z beta, when we are doing it in comparison between two groups, we include this Z also. For 0.10, that is 10% power, we have this value as 1.282. And for 20%, we have this 0.842 as the Z beta value. And we have seen this is the sample size calculation for single proportion, that is n is equal to z square pq by d square. Z is 1.96, z square is 3.84, so we can call it as 3.84 pq by d square, where p is the prevalence, q is the 100 minus p, d is the precision or otherwise called as absolute precision. We have two types of precision, absolute and relative precision. What we substitute here is called as absolute precision, and the relative precision is the precision in relation to the prevalence. Suppose 10% relative precision means 10% of prevalence. That is, if suppose prevalence is 50%, 10% of 50% will be 5%. So the absolute precision here, it will be 5%. So we need to substitute and calculate for sample size calculation of single group proportion here. So as I mentioned here, Z is standard normal deviate or Z value, which is 1.96. P is prevalence or proportion. Q is 100 minus P. D is clinically expected variation, that is absolute precision. When mean is the parameter of study for a single group, it is n equal to Z square standard deviation square divided by precision square, where Z is the standard normal deviate, S is the sample standard deviation, D is the clinically expected variation, which we will decide before the study. And we have two groups formula, which I have not mentioned here, but we have mentioned it as charts, which will be displayed above. Watch that video for sample size calculation of two groups, mean and proportion. The types of reviews, we have different types of review: scientific review, ethical review, regulatory review, and peer review. And we have different stages of clinical trials, that is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Phase 1 is for safety and acceptability. Phase 2 is for long-term safety, dosing and scheduling, early indications of efficacy. Phase 3 is for effectiveness. Phase 4 is post-marketing surveillance. Phase 1 is done among 50 healthy volunteers. Phase 2 is among 100 to 500 low-risk patients. Phase 3 is among 1000 and more high-risk patients. Phase 4 is among 1000 and more community-based patients. Then we have discussed about sampling, randomization and blinding. Sampling is the process by which we select the sample from the study population, and randomization is the process by which we, after selecting the sample from the study population, we decide the groups based on a phenomenon called as randomization. When these two participants are not aware of what group they are in, that is called as blinding at the level of the subjects, and double blinding, where the patients and the interviewers will not know, and when the person who collect the data also does not know, then that is called as triple blinding. Then we have discussed about the research question. We have used the finer acronym. F stands for feasible, I stands for interesting, novel, ethical and relevant, and this is the acronym for the research question. PICOT, population intervention comparison group, outcome and time. In case of observational studies, it is called as PICOT, that is PECOT, where E stands for exposure. We have seen about the sources of research question, which can be from the published literature. When we are alert to new ideas and techniques, we keep the imagination roaming, and whatever our guide or the mentor says, based on that we derive our research question. Then we have discussed about different stages of evolution of the ethics in health research. So we have discussed about Nuremberg Code, Helsinki's declaration, which was revised subsequently, then Belmont's report, CIOMS guidelines, then ICH or International Council on Harmonization, which provides the good clinical practice. Ultimately, the 4 ethical principles for research are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Autonomy is respecting the individual rights. Beneficence is doing good for the patients. Non-maleficence is doing no harm. Justice is doing the right or fair for the individual or the right for the situation. Evidence of the autonomy, that is the informed consent document. Here we have the different parts of the consent document. We need to describe our research first. We need to describe the risk, benefits, alternatives, confidentiality, compensation involved in the study. Then we need to mention the participation is voluntary and withdrawal at any time is possible. We need to collect the signature of the participant and we need to collect the signature of the witness also. So many of the clinical trials nowadays demands video consent. We need to register under Clinical Trial Registry of India, CTRI we say. We have seen about this life cycle of research where we identify the data needs, spell out the research question, formulate the study objectives, plan for analysis, plan for data collection instruments, collect the data, analyze the data, draw conclusions, we provide recommendations, then we inform the stakeholders, then the stakeholders do some transformations, then there will be a data needs, and this cycle continues. This cycle is called as life cycle of research. They have mentioned about the life cycle of research, and there is a similar phenomenon which they have mentioned in the later part of the research called process of health research, where we need to ensure that the data is collected systematically. We need to draw meaningful conclusions, make appropriate decisions, take appropriate action for prevention and control of diseases. We need to take evidence-based actions. Actions should reduce the suffering and ultimately improve the health and well-being of the community. Then we have mentioned about this dimensions of research. We have theoretical research and applied research, preventive and therapeutic research, benchmark-based research and bedside research, exploratory research and confirmatory research, implementation research and translation research. All comes under dimensions of research. The breadth and depth of inquiry in health research. Within the human body, we inquire the healthy, susceptible with the disease and death. Surrounding environment and society, we study the climatic factors, housing, vectors, animal, social, cultural practices, family structure. We study healthcare infrastructure and its delivery also. Here are the steps in conceiving a research question. First, we need to review the state of art information. We need to raise a question, decide worth investigating by the peer review, define measurable exposures and outcome, sharpen the initial question, refine the question by specifying details. We have 7 steps of a successful protocol. We need to identify the topic, question and objective in the first step. 1-page concept paper, prepare dummy tables, write draft protocol, prepare instruments and annexes, submit it to the peer review, then institutional ethical committee review. All 7 steps of the successful protocol. Here are the steps of the research mentioned here. We have the research question, which is always an uncertainty or otherwise called as the data need, and should specify what we want to know, and this should be specific on a single issue in everyday language. The basic difference between each question, the research objective is, here it is everyday language and here it is the scientific or epidemiological term. So we should apply the so what test also, that is we should subject it into finer, that is feasible, interesting, novel, ethical and relevant. Research question should pass. From that we derive the research hypothesis. This is the basis for the tests of statistical significance. Only for analytical studies we have this hypothesis. If our study is a descriptive study, there will not be any research hypothesis. All this research hypothesis should be simple, specific and stated in advance. When we refine the research objective, the everyday language will become scientific and epidemiological terms. And here we have more than one action word. Here we have only one action verb, and we divide it into primary and secondary objective based on the focus. So that is given under steps of research. Basically, pilot study is a small scale preliminary research project which we do after all the required approvals before the start of the study. It is kind of trial of the research, so that we will correct and we will do the main research after that. Its purpose is to refine the research methodologies, data collection instruments, that is any change in the tools and methodologies can be done. You can record the time and validity of the instruments which we use, that is accuracy of the instruments which we use. We can do an experimental procedure before conducting a full-scale study. Its purpose is to identify any potential issues or limitations and make necessary adjustments to ensure ensure the success of the larger scale study. So that is the pilot study. Then we move on to the data collection tools. Here the key slides are presented. Most of the questions can be subdivided into facts. Most of the times it will be individual characteristics. In health research, majority of the data will be based on this individual characteristics. And if it is related to public health or community medicine, most of the details will be from this. So individual characteristics, example, age, height, clinical history. For environment, it is housing and family size. Under facts, we have behavioral practices that can be alcohol use and drug prescription. Under knowledge, we can assess some of the risk factors and lifestyles. The judgments of people also can be asked as a question. So that is opinions, attitudes, their attitude about open defecation can be asked in the data collection. So these are all the different kind of data which we can collect from the participants in our research. And what are the different tools to use to collect data? We have three type of tools. Number one is the abstraction form. Number two is the structured observation guide. Number three is the questionnaire, which we commonly use in most of the health researchers. In the abstraction form, we will review the records. We take either the personal records or the clinical records or the surveillance records, registers. We will get the information from the abstraction form. Now the structured observation guide is the checklist of items. We have text and figures, and through that we collect the data. The difference between the questionnaire and the study pro forma is questionnaire is set of questions aimed to measure a particular outcome is called as questionnaire. Suppose let's say we are assessing the sleep quality with 20 questions, then that is called as a questionnaire. And with that questionnaire, if we club some other attributes of the patients, all your risk factors related, environment related, individual characteristics related, then it will become a study pro forma. So that questionnaire can be either interviewer administered or self-administered. Interviewer administered can be done through face-to-face, one-to-one, we can do that, or you can make the interviewer administered through telephones, or it can be computer assisted. The self-administered, again, we can distribute the paper, or we can do the computer assisted self-administered questionnaire. So these are the different ways which we can collect data for our health research. Components of the data collection tool. First, we always have the introduction and conclusion section. We will present our objectives, provide the information related to the informed consent. Then we have the identifiers, that is the exact identifiers such as name, address can be there, and the body of the instrument, which can be either open, closed or semi-open. Finally, the instruction for the data collectors also will be there. Instructions and where to use prompts and where to use the skip patterns, and we should use different fonts also. So all these are all the four components of the data collection tool. Now, what are all the key elements which we should consider when we are dealing with the data collection tools? First, the questions should be of good clarity and the words should be clear and the apt words should be used. There should be the balance of phrases, and the length of the sentences also should not be too lengthy or too short, and the responses should be comprehensive. The responses may exceed your comprehensiveness. Then you can add an option called others. You can ask them to specify the reason also. Consider the constraints of the response and the utility through the instructions. Then we have to consider the order and context of the questions. So when we are sorting out the order of the questions which we should ask first, we should follow the following principles: from simple to complicated questions, then from general topics to specific topics, then from casual questions to intimate questions. Then we should group together all the topics related to a particular topic. Then we should have the identification questions at the beginning. So it should be also be in a chronological order. If questions related to the sequence of events, suppose you are asking antenatal history, the antenatal history related other risk factors also can be completed all together. Then we have to introduce simple questions as a break if the questionnaire is too complex. Then we can triangulate the information through multiple questions on the same topic that we use in qualitative research also. Now about the laying out the tool, we need to split the sections. So always, instead of presenting it as a 20 questions, if we present it as 2 sections of 10 each, questionnaire fatigue will not be there. Then we need to space out the questions. Then we need to number all the questions. The questions can be present with large fonts. Then we need to align answers on the right side. Then we need to standardize the coding. We have open questions, closed questions, under which we have dichotomous response yes or no, multiple options, and or quantitative answers. All can be considered as a closed questions. And we have semi-open questions. When we include others specify into the option, we call it as semi-open questions. questions. This is the type of the questions which we can include in a questionnaire or study pro forma. These are the principles which we should follow when we are formulating the questions. It should be short and precise, and we should avoid ambiguities, and we should ask one question at a time. Then we should not include double negatives, and the question should be of neutral tone. The tone of your question should not direct the participant to answer in a particular way. Now, these are the 6 steps in data collection. We need to draft the question by question guide. Then we need to train the staff members who will collect the data. We need to initiate the data collection and ensure the quality, review the collected data for quality and completeness, then debrief to troubleshoot the difficulties. Then we need to validate. Validate means we need to check for accuracy. So that is the 6 steps involved in the data collection. We should identify the design of the study, whether it is a case control study, cohort study, or cross-sectional study. Then we will identify parameters specific to that study design. Let's say case control study, we have odds ratio as the parameter of study. So in our mind, for the data analysis purpose, we should think about the study design and the parameters of importance. Then we will identify the major variables. That is, for odds ratio, we should have an exposure and outcome factors. So the main study variables, we need to decide the outcome and the exposure factors. Then we should become familiar with the data. Then we should characterize the study population. Then after that, we will understand about the outcome and the exposure. Then we should create the additional two-way tables. Some other exposure factors can be studied. Then we should conduct advanced analysis such as regression. So basically, when we are dealing with the data, these are all the fundamental principles for sequence of data analysis strategy. We have described about the uses of cross-sectional study. We can estimate the prevalence, distribution of the health problem by time, place, and person. We can also plan the healthcare service delivery. We can set priorities, generate hypotheses, examine evolving trends, before and after surveys. Iterative cross-sectional surveys can be performed. So all these are uses of cross-sectional study. We have seen about the advantages and disadvantages of cross-sectional study. It is fairly quick and easy to perform. It is less expensive, and limitation is it is not useful to study disease etiology, not suitable for the study of rare diseases. This is the slide on types of cohort studies, where we have 3 types of cohort studies: prospective, ambispective, retrospective. The basic principle about cohort study is it starts from exposure and look for the outcome or the disease, and the direction will be from the exposure to disease. If suppose we start the study before the exposure and the disease or the outcome has occurred, then we call that as a prospective or forward-looking cohort study. On the other hand, if we are starting the study after the occurrence of some amount of exposure, then we follow it up for the occurrence of the disease. That is called as ambispective study. Suppose, let's say we are starting the study after the exposure and the disease or the outcome has already occurred, and we start very late by looking it backwards. That is called as retrospective cohort study. So these are the types of cohort studies based on the position which we stand in the research. We have seen about the advantages, disadvantages of the RCTs. We have also seen about the inclusion and exclusion criteria, how we frame the inclusion and exclusion criteria, what are all the parameters or the characteristics of the population which we need to include and which we need to exclude has been given in the slide. The purpose of organized research in literature review. Why we need this is we need to organize the information that is related to the research question. We need to synthesize results, summary of what is known and what is not known. We can create the current knowledge of the topic, and we will identify certain defects in that current knowledge, and we will try to fulfill that gap with our study. Then we need to develop questions for the further research. So that is the purpose of organized research in literature review. Then why we need this literature review? First of all, we need to save our time, know the topic more in depth, and we need to suggest new research if we cannot fulfill the existing gap. Then where to get this review of literature done? The most common places are publications, textbooks, and website. Websites will provide most new information, followed by your publications, followed by your textbook. If you take the authenticity or validity or accuracy of the information, then textbook will be ranked number number one, followed by publication, followed by websites. And how are we going to do this literature review? We are doing the literature review by information seeking and critical appraisal, scholarly critical appraisal. We need to select the good points with that article and compare the methods and results and tabulate the results like this. Then we have to organize the information from recent to past. So the chronologically placed information from recent to past. We need to write the introduction, empirical literature and summary. We need to consider the ethical issues also when we are doing review of literature. We should not distort the content. We should mention the citation, design, objectives, study population, sample size, the outcomes and results, the author's conclusion, all can be mentioned as a table so that can compare the existing literature about the topic. This is the appropriate places to search. Under websites and publications, we have this general info from the websites. We have HON certified websites. Currently, this HON certification is not very active, but the HON certified sites are very authentic to quote in your research. We have web search engines like Google and other indexing agencies like PubMed, Scopus, Google Scholar and all there. Then we have the systematic reviews, meta-analysis, Cochrane Library and Map of Medicine. And you can access the free open access journals and fee-based journals from the libraries of your universities or the access which you can get. We have seen about the concept paper. First, we should have the background and justification or otherwise introduction or the need for the study. So you should justify your study in this section with 2 or 3 bullets. Then you should clearly state your objectives. Under methods, 3 to 4 points, and then expected benefits, then key references, budget also can be mentioned in a 1-page concept paper. Then we have the characteristics of a good hypothesis. It should be simple, specific, stated in advance. So simple means it should have one exposure and one outcome. Specific means there should not be any ambiguity about the study participants or variables, and it should be stated in advance. Then we have seen about the differences between confounding and effect modifier. When we are studying the association between exposure and outcome, there will be a third factor which influences are related to both exposure and outcome, and it is distributed unequally among the study and your control group. And because it is distributed unequally, this will mimic an artificial association between this exposure and outcome. That sort of bias is called as confounding bias. It is not a true relationship between this exposure and outcome. When we are studying alcohol use and bladder cancer, you may find an association in the crude analysis. When you stratify during the analysis, you have taken only smokers and non-smokers, this association which we have found out here will disappear. If it disappears, then that is a confounding variable, or this variable has caused confounding bias. On the other hand, if it is an effect modifier, when you do a crude analysis, as usual, you will find a significant association between the exposure and the outcome. But you suspect a third variable which is playing a confounding or effect modifier role, then you do this stratification based on the family history. Third factor has played an effect modification role. In the other group, there will not be no association. So that is how we differentiate between confounding variable and effect modifier variable. And how to reduce this confounding, I have mentioned about the matching here only. You can see the stratification also here. The other ways to reduce this confounding is we can restrict those individuals. Suppose, let's say, if you include smokers into the study, you will infuse confounding into the study. Then you can restrict or remove all the smokers from the study. You should study within the smokers and non-smokers. That will be the best way. Or you can do matching, or you can do randomization. So randomization distributes smokers and non-smokers equally into your alcoholics and non-alcoholics. Then this confounding will disappear. And during analysis stage, we can have the stratification or the multivariate analysis where we do adjusted odds ratio calculation. So the influence of one factor over the other one can be controlled with advanced regression analysis. So that is how the multivariate analysis will be performed. Under publication ethics, they have mentioned about the ethics review and the breach of confidentiality. So we should get the IEC approval, and whatever we propose for IEC approval, we should follow it, and we should follow the consent form. We should follow the CTRI, that is Clinical Trial Registry of India registration. So this CTRI is for every intervention, if it is an interventional study, it's a mandate that we should do CTRI. For drug trials, it is mandated that we should use video consent. Then we should maintain the data confidentially. We should not share unnecessarily with anyone outside the study. Then we should not follow the fabrication and falsification of the data. We have ICMJE, that is International Committee of Medical Journal Editors recommendation is there. It has mentioned the criteria for authorship. The author should have substantial contributions in conception, design, acquisition, analysis, interpretation of the data. Then they should have drafted the work, revised it critically for important intellectual content. Then final approval should have been given. Then agreement to accountable to all aspects of the work related to accuracy, integrity. When you have all these contribution, then only you can become eligible for authorship. So that is recommended by ICMJE. So we have ghost authors and guest authors. Ghost author is somebody who does all the work for you. Guest author is after you completing the work, so you gift the authorship to somebody who may be your senior or your friend, etc., etc. Then we have plagiarism. In Latin, plagiarism means kidnapping. That is, you are taking somebody's knowledge, content, words, or a segment of the article without their permission. Self-plagiarism, salami, or redundant publications are all considered under plagiarism. We should follow certain ethics related to submission. We should not do simultaneous submission with two journals. Then we should know about predatory journals, the journals which functions only for money, and the standards will not be maintained. So whatever displayed in their site will be false information, and that is the major disadvantage with the open access policy which the journal follows. Then we have to follow the COPE guidelines, that is Committee on Publication Ethics guidelines for ethics related to submission. Then we should also know about the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest means it is the discrepancy or the conflict or the fight between the researcher and the research objective. That can be a financial interest, personal interest, social or other interest also can be possible. So that is about the publication ethics. Then we have IMRAD structure for a research article. We have 4 common headings, that is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. If you ask me, introduction is why, methods is how, results is what, how much, discussion is so what. Introduction means why did you start the study, methods means what did you do in this study, results means what did you find in this study, discussion means what does it all mean. That is called as IMRAD structure of a research paper. When we expand it under introduction, we need to zoom in, we need to provide a background knowledge, we need to make the current knowledge and the knowledge gap present in the literature. Study rationale will be trying to fill in that gap, and we develop the need for the study and the objectives based on that. Then we have methods, we have different headings for methods. Then results, the basics of the results, we should present the study findings with the tables, figures, image and all. And then discussion, we need to summarize the results, not repeating the results. Then after that, we need to interpret and infer the result. We need to compare it with the other studies. And as we mentioned here, the knowledge gap, we try to fit our knowledge into that gap. So that is the purpose of this discussion. We mentioned the strength, limitation and recommendations also. The purpose of keywords is to help the indexers and the search engine find the relevant papers, which will lead to more reads. It will lead to more citation also. We have this abstract or summary, that is a miniature manuscript. It may be structured or unstructured. Most commonly read, usually 100 to 350 words long. It will be in a plain language summary. References, all sources of information need to be referred. Relevant and recent references need to be done. Bibliography management, all your Zotero and Mendeley can be used. Styles, most commonly Vancouver, Harvard, Chicago manual styling will be used, but as per the journals and university recommendation, you can use your own style. So that is about the IMRAD structure of research article. Under methodology, we have these headings mentioned in the lecture. Under grants writing, we have mentioned in this part 2 video about the budget and justification. Here is the example of budget. This will be the last slide about the grants writing. For increasing the chances of success, we to study the successful protocols. Then we need to have a collaborative network, multidisciplinary team, align with the agency's goals, establish good track record before going large. So all these can increase the chance of success. For seeking funding for a project, these are the steps. We need to decide on the type of the project. We need to find the funding agencies, then tailor the general proposal which we made to the call for the funding agencies. Then we need to submit the letter of inquiry and the full proposal. Then the agency reviews and makes decision. After that, we need to accept or decline. Then we need to complete the formalities. is we need to carry out the project, then submit the report to the agencies. For increasing the chance of success while developing the protocol, we need to have a solid rationale or justification of the study. Then we need to highlight the knowledge gap and the novelty which is present in our study. Then we need to highlight the impact of work in terms of the societal benefit. We need to have appropriate budget with a strong justification. Then administrative parts will be in order. So when we develop a proposal with these requisites, then it will increase the chance of success. I wish you all the best for your exams. Please post your comments and feedback in the comment section. If you like this video, please click on the like button and share it to your friends. Thanks again.